Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Vav. This is the daf for Shabbat. To get started, we're going to do a very quick review, starting from the first Mishnah, really, of the Masechet. Kol Zevachim shenizbechu shelo lishma ksherim ela shelo alu lebaalim l'shem chova. We had this statement: any sacrifices offered not in the name, right, in the name of the wrong sacrifice, are ksherim, they're kosher, but meaning you continue and sacrifice them, but they don't fulfill the obligation. This sentence caused a lot of questioning. Reish Lakish said, so I don't understand. If they're ksherim, then they should atone. If they're not, then why are we bringing them? To which Rabbi Elazar said, we have this precedent with the yoled, with the woman who gives birth, who then is supposed to bring her sacrifice, but then dies. Her heirs bring the sacrifice, the ola one. So Reish Lakish says, okay, fine. You've explained to me the ola, again, meaning, right, they're not getting anything from this, but yet they're bringing it anyway. So Reish Lakish said, fine, I get the ola, but what about the guilt offering? So to which, that was on yesterday's daf at the top of the daf. At the end of the daf, we have Rav Nachman, Rav Shesha, Rav Hadran, who were sitting and discussing and said, Reish Lakish could have said, why don't they bring it? And the ola is known to atone for positive commandments that people don't keep. Why don't we just say that it atones for that? To which they said it must be that the Yorshim, right, the assumption, that would mean that the Yorshim acquire it. And then they said, well, the Yorshim don't acquire it, right? And that would resolve the question against Reish Lakish. You can't say it because in order for it to atone for their mitzvot aseh, their positive commandments, they would have to have acquired it, and they don't acquire it. To which the Gemara asks, and this is the very end of yesterday's daf, we're going to start here, lo kanyalu, what, they don't acquire it? V'hamar Rabbi Yochanan, and now we're going to see the heirs do acquire, and how we're going to learn it from the laws of substitution. If someone leaves an animal for his two sons and they die, kreva, it's sacrificed ve'emim. But if they try to do tamura, which is forbidden, but usually even if you do tamura when it's forbidden, it still is effective. How does it work? Both the original animal is consecrated and the one you tried to substitute for in its place is also consecrated. But if the two sons do it, it's not. Now, they're trying to figure out why is it not effective. Well, if you say they acquired it, then it makes sense because then this matches another thing we know, which is then they're like partners. And shutfin lomatsu memirim, right? Partners, two people jointly own something, substitution is ineffective completely. Why is it ineffective? Because there's a singular language used throughout the entire section about Tamura in the Torah, and from there they learn only a single owner and not partners. So now we're assuming, right, that's why when the heirs consecrate it, when they substitute it, it's not effective because they're partial owners, right? They jointly own something, and jointly owned items can't affect substitution, right? You can't affect substitution with that jointly owned item. And that would then say that this whole explanation we brought before about they're not kone is not true, right? Because if you say they didn't acquire it, amure nami lemru, then the tamura should be effective. To which the Gemara answers, shani hatam damakra im hamir yamir l'rabot tayoresh echad mimir ve'en shnayim mimirim. So now they're going to say no. The reason why the two heirs don't affect substitution is a different reason. It has nothing to do with because they're like shutfim, they don't own it, and that will resolve our issue. But what's the issue? There's a special drasha im hamer yamir because of the double language. It could just say im himir, not hamer yamil. L'rabot tayoresh, that includes even an heir can do tamura, meaning again can't do it, it's forbidden, but if they do, it's effective. But only one heir if there's a single heir who does it, but not if there's multiple heirs. If there's multiple heirs, they can't affect substitution. So now we understand why these two sons can't do it. Their substitution is ineffective because they're two and not one, and because of this drasha. Okay, and that resolves it. And that resolved our problem. What do you mean they don't acquire? But they should acquire. And if they do acquire, then back to Reish Lakish's what they tried to say Reish Lakish should have said, he should have said it should affect atonement for them. But the answer is no, it doesn't, because they don't acquire. So now we have a question on this answer, a difficulty. Matkifla Rabbi Yaakov min harpakot elameata, and there's the problem with this im hamir yamir, which is the reason why Yorshim can't, is because of a specific drasha. Well, he says, Elameataf, you're going to have that drasha by Masir Sheni, the second tithe. You bring it to Jerusalem, but usually you don't bring your fruits, you redeem them onto a coin. If you redeem them onto a coin and you're the owner who does it, you have to add an extra fifth, which actually is a quarter, but it's called a chomesh, and you have to add that to the amount of money when you redeem the food onto money. But if somebody else does the subs of the pidyon, the redeeming the fruit onto a coin, and they do it with someone else's fruits, they do it for them. Let's say someone does it on my behalf, but with their money, they don't have to add the extra chomesh, the fifth. So what does it say there? The question is, who has to add the fifth? Obviously the owner. And who else is like the owner? Well, what about an heir? Im gaol yigal l'rabot et hayoresh. There we have the same double language, gaol yigal, which we darshim im hamir yamir, l'rabot et hamimir hayoresh for tmura, but only one and not two because of the singular language. Well, if you say the singular language is going to teach us also one and not two. So wait, if two heirs redeem their father's fruits that they inherited onto a coin, they don't have to add a fifth, and basically we know that's not the case. They do. So that knocks out the drasha, which was what we used to resolve our whole issue, to which they say, no, that's not a knockout because shane ma'asil tikabe avuha nami ita b'shutfut. Tmura, as I said before, all throughout the section of Tmura uses single language, and from there they learn only one person can affect substitution and not partners. Therefore, but by Maaser Sheni, if the father originally was partners with people and he did it himself and didn't die, he would have to add a fifth, and the partner would have to add a fifth. In other words, the laws of Maaser Sheni apply in partnerships. The laws of substitution don't apply in partnerships. So the drasha was really Im Hamer Yamirim Gaol Yigal. It includes the heir. The part about one and not two is because just like the father himself could only do Tamura if he was the single owner, also the son can only do Tamura if he's the single owner. And that's the reason, and that doesn't basically contradict what we said before, because you could still hold that drasha, and that will resolve our issue that the heir substitution is effective even though he's not the owner. But now comes the Gemara and says, wait, right? So that two, I messed that up. It is right, but we're going to go back. But two and not one, right? Two cannot affect substitution. What we really learned from this part, I was confusing it with the next part, so sorry about that. Two cannot affect substitution because of a special drasha about Tamura in general. Okay, but that's not because they own it and because that they're shutvim and because of that is the problem. I'm going to Rav Ashi the Rav Ashi. But now Rav Ashi says to Rav Ashi, umina, but wait, from the one who can affect Tamura, you should actually be able to learn that they own it because how can one heir affect substitution if they don't own it? Okay, and now we're going to see that in order, we haven't seen this yet, but in order to affect substitution, you actually have to be the owner. Okay, so now we're going to see. But if you say the son doesn't acquire it, which then goes back to saying, oh, maybe heirs do acquire things like sacrifices, right? They do acquire the sacrifices, and then that goes back to why didn't Reish Lakish say that then, that they could get atonement? How could they possibly be substitute if they're not the owner of the sacrifice? Because look at, this is part of the question, proving that you would have to own it in order to affect substitution. The Hama, right? Until now we said you have to be a single owner to affect substitution, but you have to be an owner. How are we going to see this? Because, right, we thought maybe, well, there's the drasha that includes the Yoresh, even though the Yoresh is not an owner. But now we're going to see the Yoresh would have to be an owner because Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yochanan, Hamakdish Mosif Chomesh, Umitkaper Oset Tmura, Vatolem Mishalo Shel Chavero Tovan Hana'ah Shelo. These are three distinct halachot. The only one that's relevant for our purposes is the middle one, but let's read them. Hamakdish Mosif Chomesh. This is similar to Maaser Sheni. If I consecrate an animal on your behalf, and then you want to redeem it, you don't have to add an extra fifth. Okay, if you want to redeem it and give its value in money instead. But if I sanctify an animal on your behalf, and then I want to redeem the money, since I was the one who did it, even though it was for your on your behalf, it's me who has to add the chomesh. But when it comes to tmura, hamitkaper oset tmura, it's the one who's getting the atonement. So let's say I designate an animal for your sake to bring a korban, and then you did Tamura on it, it would be effective. If I did Tamura on it, it wouldn't be effective. So what do you see? The person who gets the atonement, who we assume means the person who's the owner, is the one who can effect substitution, not the heir who's not the owner of the korban. And the third halacha is hatorei mishelo shel chavero tovad hana'ah shelo. If I give truma on your, now I'm confusing the two words, right? Truma, tmura. Truma is if I give the gifts to the Kohen, right? The 1/50th of the produce to the Kohen. If I give from my produce on yours, meaning you picked lemons and I have lemons that I picked from my tree, and I say, listen, I'm going to give the truma from my produce, and that's going to help your produce, meaning that'll exempt your produce. I'm going to give it on your produce. I'm going to give 1/50th of your lemons from mine, though. So I can do that. And not only that, but who gets to choose which Kohen we give it to? I get to choose because I'm the one who did it. Okay. And therefore, that's the Tovat Hana'ah. I can get the benefit, which is I did something nice for a Kohen. Maybe the Kohen will do something back for me. So I get to choose. Anyway, the point being, the mitkaper oseh tmura. How could the son get to affect tmura if he's not the one who owns it? We assume mitkaper means owner. Well, now the Gemara is going to say there's two kinds of kapara. And mikiva lo mechapra, mikufya mechapra. From the real atonement of that sacrifice, whatever that sacrifice was coming to atone, that the heir does not get atonement for. But mikufya, Rashi says kufya comes from the word kappa, which means floating. Okay, the heir gets a floating type of atonement. Okay, atonement, which the current translates as incidental atonement, which means there's some sort of level of atonement that the son will get. It's not the real atonement of the sacrifice, it's a partial, but because it's partial, it's enough to affect Tamura. So it's not clear exactly what atonement the son gets, but he gets some sort of atonement because he brought a korban. It's not what it was meant for. And that means that in the end, he's really not the owner because he doesn't really get the atonement. He gets some partial atonement, but that's enough to say the substitution is valid. With that, we end that section and we resolved why Reish Lakish didn't say they bring the korban. And that means, right, they should have gotten atonement from it. And that's the value of them bringing this korban and the children and the chatat case. Why didn't he respond to Rabbi Elazar? Seems didn't respond that because really they're not the owners. That would presume they were the owners. They would get atonement. They can't because they're not the owners. And whatever we tried to prove from Tamura, in the end, gets rejected. Now we have a question, which again goes back to this root of the issue of the very strange thing about this Mishnah. Kipru amashabau or lo kipru. So do you get atonement or not? When you bring that first sacrifice that was done shelo lishma, and you finish up the process, do you get atonement or do you not get atonement? Amar Rav Shesha Bereit Rav Idi, Mistabra de lo kipru, de isakatatach kipru sheni lama huba. He says pretty obvious to say that they don't get atonement because if you would get atonement for the first one, then why would you need to bring a second sacrifice? Seems pretty logical. But the Gemara throws that back a question at him and says, Elamai, lo kipru lamu karev. But what are you going to say then? You don't get atonement from the first one? Well, if you don't get atonement from the first one, then why is it brought at all? To which Rav Ashi explains, Amar Rav Ashi, Rav Sheshet, which is really Rav Sheshet, Berei Rav Idi hacha kakashile. What he was really saying, they say this is what was difficult for him. This is what he questioned, but what really means is why he came up with the answer he came up with is Iyamar bishlama lo kipru shelo lishmo mikoach lishmaka devasheni lamahuba lechapir. So listen, I'll explain it like this. If you say lo kipru, I can explain it because shelo lishmo mikoach lishmo kate. The first one is coming because originally from the get-go you designated that animal for the purposes of the proper sacrifice. Only down the road, when you slaughtered it or did some part of the process, it was done shelo lishma. But you're going to keep sacrificing that because it has koch in it from the fact that it was originally designated lishma, and therefore you just go ahead with the process. And then, but not to atone. It doesn't atone. Sheni lamahuba. Why does the second one come then? Lechaper. That one is obviously to take the place of the first one and to atone. Ela iyamar kipru. But if you say it atoned, well then sheni lamahuba, then why are you bringing the second one at all? There'd be no reason to bring the second one. So that's why he comes to the conclusion that it must not atone. Last question for today, although we're still not even on Amud Bet, so obviously this question is going to take us for a while. We're going to have two attempted answers to this question. Ibailu. Now the topic here is an ola. Okay, perhaps they're talking about this because we just talked about once you designate something, lishma, it has value to it, right? There's something about, okay, we're going to talk about the different stages, although we're going to get off on a totally different topic here. We start with the stage of I designated an animal, and then we have when I slaughtered the animal. So comes the Gemara and asks, now Korban Ola we said, and this is really probably why it's coming, because way back in the beginning of the sugya already from yesterday, we saw that the Korban Ola is machaper at the end of yesterday's daf. The Korban Ola, the burnt offering, atones for positive commandments that I didn't do. Okay, not for negative transgressions, but if I didn't fulfill a positive commandment. So now they want to know, let's say I designate an animal, and we saw that it could, or maybe we didn't see this, but an Ola can atone for many sins that I did in the past. If I didn't do a number of positive commandments, the Korban Ola that I bring will atone for that. And that's why they asked about the sons, right? Why didn't they just bring her Korban Ola and say it's going to atone, right? And it would atone for their sins, their missed opportunities of positive mitzvah. So So I designate an animal for an Ola. So obviously it's going to cover any positive commandments that I didn't fulfill from before that moment. But what if I then, after I designate it, another month passes till I sacrifice it, or a day, or whatever it might be, and I miss an opportunity for a positive commandment, I don't do it. And then we want to know when I slaughter that animal after, between T1 and T2, right, between the time I designated it to the time I slaughtered it, is it going to atone or not? Will that korban cover it? Here come the two signs. Mi amrina, do we say, midi have a chatat? Well, it should be just like a sin offering. Ma chatat, now a chatat goes on that one sin. So obviously it's only going to be for something I did before I designated the animal. I wouldn't designate an animal if I didn't do anything wrong. So ma chatat dekodem afrasha in de lachar afrasha, it's only going to cover things from before I designated the animal, and obviously not after. Av hachanami, say the same thing here. Dekodem afrasha in lachar afrasha. We'll take a model of where a korban atones for a sin, and it only atones for sins from before I designated. So why don't we say the same thing is true here? Oh, dilma, or perhaps lo damya lachata, but it's not like a chatat at all. The chatat al kol chet uchet ba'ili tuyachad chatat. If I did 5 sins before I brought the chatat, I would have to bring separate chatats on each one. The hacha, but here, kevanda ika kama ase gabe mechapra, but here, this would atone theoretically if I did 5 missed positive commandments before I designated the animal, it would cover them. So maybe ase de lachar fashanami mechapra. Maybe it'll also atone for things I did after. Okay, that's our question. To which the Gemara answers, first answer, Tashma, we're going to learn it from smicha. The smicha that we do, smicha is when you put your weight on the animal, or you put your hands on the head of the animal, kind of bear some weight on it. This whole thing in the Ramban about how that's like passing on your sins to the animal, but that's a whole other thing. It's one opinion. Anyway, it's a very interesting one about the purpose of korbanot. But anyway, what it says here is v'samach and ... Okay, you put your hand on the head of the ola, v'nirtza lechapel, and it is accepted to atone for you. Now, it sounds like from the simple reading that smicha affects atonement. But does smicha affect atonement? Of course not. It's the blood that atones. And how do we go? This shenema in the commandment in Vayikra, where it says, don't eat blood, in Vayikra, Yud, chapter 17. It says, Ki adam hu benefesh yichapel. It's the blood that atones. So so why does it say that if it doesn't work? Well, it wants to tell you, and now this is going to be this very unclear statement, which we're going to deal with for a little while. Shiraim are like leftovers. If you treated smicha like a leftover, meaning you didn't do it, you decided this wasn't essential, I'm just not going to do it. This is very confusing. It's going to be like you, if you skip smicha, it's as if you didn't get atonement, but you actually do get atonement, assuming, right, you sprinkle the blood and all that. So what is this? It's as if you didn't, but you did. The way they're going to read this is, on something you got atonement, on something else you didn't. So my love is this not to keep hair. What do you get atonement for? I say, kodem afrasha, you're going to get atonement for all the previous sins. Lo kipel, what are you not going to get atonement for? Well, what have you done? Notice, you've skipped a mitzvah aseh. The mitzvah aseh of smicha you haven't done. So you're not going to get atonement for the aseh of smicha. Tahavale aseh delachar frasha. Why are you not going to get atonement for smicha, for the fact that you skipped smicha here? So this is going to atone for all your previous sins, but it's not going to atone for anything after frasha, i.e. smicha, because you skipped doing the mitzvah of smicha, and you're not going to get atonement for it. Why not? Must be because it's in mitzvah aseh that was transgressed, you missed it, after you already designate the animal, because obviously you're only going to do smicha after you designate the animal, and that's when you missed your opportunity, and that's when you're not going to get atonement for, because we don't get atonement for sins that are after hafresh. And that would be our answer, if only it were so simple. But comes Rava, Amal Rava, aseh de smicha kamarta. No, you're very confused. If you want to prove this from the aseh of smicha and your missed opportunity, and you're claiming that when's the missed opportunity, right? Obviously, after you designate the animal, before you slaughtered it, makes sense, because that's when you're supposed to do smicha. But that's not true. Why? Now, this is very confusing, because not confusing, but it raises this issue. When do you transgress not keeping a positive command? Only when there's no more opportunity to do it. Because if it's, I just didn't do something, right? Let's say I didn't take a lulav on the first day of Sukkot. When would I transgress that? The arba meaning. When would I transgress that? At the very end of the first day, not in the morning if I didn't do it, or the afternoon. It would have to be, right? When the day passes and I didn't do it, it would be at sunset, when I can no longer do the mitzvah. Okay, then I would transgress it, not before that. So when's the moment that I transgress smicha? I can do smicha until I slaughter the animal. Once I slaughter the animal, it's too late. So they say the following: Shani hatam to call kamadelo shachit. As long as I don't slaughter it, ba'amod usmochkai, I'm still commanded at this point to do smicha. I haven't yet done anything wrong. Emet kabe aseh. So when have I transgressed this mitzvah aseh? What point is it no longer possible? La'achar shchita. Once I slaughter it, once the slaughtering is done. La'achar shchita lo kamabaylan. And we're not talking after shchita. Obviously, if I slaughter it and then it turns out it's clear, then at that point I didn't do smicha, well, my smicha transgression is after the moment of slaughtering. And we're talking about in between designating and slaughtering, not after slaughtering. Of course, after slaughtering, it's too late. Slaughter the animal. That's why you don't get kapara. So Rebbe says, I agree with you that kippur and lo kippur is kippur on everything before, meaning really it actually could be even before slaughtering, possibly. He doesn't know, but he's just saying you can't prove it. Lo kippur is anything after slaughtering, like smicha. But Amalei Rav, so that rejects this as using this as an answer. Now Rav Huna Bar Yehuda says to Rava, he says you could have even suggested, he doesn't agree that the answer was right in the first place and that you could use this to get to an answer. He says maybe even you could say kippur and lo kippur means something completely different. And he brings a proof, which we're going to eventually reject the proof, but perhaps you could still say his possibility is a possibility. Ema kippur gavra, we're going to move now to Amabed. Lo kippur kamishmaya. Maybe kippur means the person gets atonement, but not as relates to God. Meaning, okay, it's a little bit hard to understand this, but I'll read from the Koran. It's not accepted by God as a perfect offering. Okay? That's the way they say it. It's just you haven't done the mitzvah perfectly. You did the sacrifice, you did the main four avodot, the shechita, Kabbalah, holacha, zrika. You did the four main things. But you didn't do smicha, so it wasn't a perfect korban. And how do I know that there's such a concept? Milotnan, does it not say in the Mishnah about the leper, Mishnah in Negaim, about leprosy? Okay, by leprosy, there's a purification process by which you bring sacrifices, and you also do this oil. You put oil. Okay, there's blood also, but we're going to talk about the oil. The Kohen takes oil in his hand, in the palm of his hand, and he puts on the right ear, the right big finger, and the right big toe of the leper. And then whatever's left in his hand, that's what we're going to talk about right now. Hanotal b'shem and asher al kaf, etc., kaf yado, and all that. He puts on the head of the leper, lechaper alav lefnei Hashem. So all the extra oil he puts on the head. Im natan kiper. If you did this, you get atonement. Im lo natan. If you didn't do it, lo kiper. There's no atonement. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. That opinion is not relevant. Okay, that sounds like it's an essential part of the mitzvah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer, shi'arei mitzvah. This is just like we talked about before, like the smicha. This is just an extra thing, not essential. Bein nitan ben shelo nitan kipel. Whether you did it or not, you're going to get atonement. Uma'alim alav ki'ilu lo kiper. So it's this exact same language and in between. Okay, it's a different order, but it's the same idea. It's as, right, they're going to do it though as if you didn't get atonement. So my ki'ilu lo kiper, what does this mean? Now, this is Rav Huna, right, Bar Yehuda, his way of reading it. Ilema, if you want to say ki'ilu lo kiper, that dibaili tuye, dimibaili tuye korban achrina, that you're going to have to bring a new korban in its place. Right, be'enitam be'en lo nitan kiper. It already said you do get atonement, so you obviously don't have to bring another sacrifice. Ela kiper must be what he was trying to prove before. Gavra lo kiper kamishmai. You just didn't do it right. And therefore, hachanami kiper gavra lo kiper kapishmai. And therefore, he says, why don't you just explain it previously like that? To which the Gemara says this isn't really the best explanation because you could say something else entirely. You could say that what this was trying to do is separate between putting the oil on the ear, finger, and toe and putting it on the head, that they're two separate things. And maybe kiper, hatamnami, there by the leper, you could say, kiper matam behono, lo kiper matnot harosh. Maybe it's saying you did part of it. You did the behono, which is the thumb and the big toe, but which also includes the ear, and that's really what it means. And lo kiper matnot harosh. You just didn't get for putting the matanot on the head. And maybe that's what it's saying. There's a distinction between these two mitzvot. So you did one part, you didn't do the other part, so you did it partial, right? For that was complete, this one was totally incomplete. And maybe that's what it means. And then what do you have to do? You have to just take another log and put it on the Kohen's head separately. Okay? Now, second attempt. So we don't even, we tried to answer the question by saying kiper, ki'ilu lo kiper. Maybe that means you don't get atonement for the smicha because it's between hafrasha and slaughtering. In the end, we said that's not the case. Okay, Tashma, next source. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kivsei Atzeret Lamahim Banim. Why do we bring the two lambs on Shavuot? Okay, there's two lambs you bring for a peace offering on Shavuot. The question is what, and you bring them with the Shtei Alechem. It's a unique chametz korban that usually we don't have chametz korbans in the temple. Anyway, you bring these two loaves. So what do you bring these for? Meaning, what sin do they atone for? To which the Gemara says, wait, stop this brighter for a minute before we go on with Rabbi Shimon. Kirset, Seret, Shlamim Yehu, they're peace offerings. They don't atone for anything. Peace offerings are not offerings of atonement. Okay, fine. So change that. Ella, it must be, we must have the wrong girsa here. Si'irei atzeret lamahim ba'im. Now we have to understand what they're talking about. There's a series in Mechad L'Chatat. If you remember, we learned this in Shavuot, that you bring on Rosh Chodesh, you bring on the holidays, right? Different times. We had a whole question, what does each one cover? So that it talks about in Bamidbar by all the holidays, and it says you bring a series for, right, a goat offering for a sin offering. Then, very uniquely though, in Parshat Emor in Sefer Vayikra, in chapter 23, verse 19, it says specifically by Shavuot that you bring a series for Chatat. It doesn't say it by any of the other holidays, so this is strange. So the rabbis believe that there were two sacrifices brought on Shavuot. So even though each one is mentioned individually, one is mentioned there and one is mentioned there, we assume they're two different offerings. Otherwise, it would have, all the ones from Bamidbar would have been mentioned in Vayikra by all the other holidays as well. You must bring two. Question is, what do you need these for? So now going back to the Braita, Rabbi Shimon says it's al tumat mikdash v'kodashav. You bring them, as we saw in Shvuah, you bring them if there's a mistake, you accidentally went into the temple when you were impure and didn't realize, either didn't realize you went into the temple or didn't realize you were impure, or you ate sacrificial meat when you were impure. Again, didn't realize it was sacrificial meat or didn't realize you were impure. And that is what it atones for. So now Rabbi Shimon continues and says, okay, but wait, let's think about this. If you already sprinkled the blood of the first, what's the second one coming to atone for? We already took care of whatever you needed. So why do you need two? So he answers, right? He asks a question and then answers it. It's to atone for any sins you did after one was brought before the next one was brought. Okay? Any tumah that happened in the interim. What does this come to teach you? And more me'ata, you can learn from here. Theoretically, there should have been korbanot going around the clock because every time someone sins, we got to deal with it right away. And, anytime there's any sort of thing, we should be doing these round the clock. But what? But the Torah saved us. In other words, said, we're going to spare you having to spend tons of money and having sacrifices going all the time, both the work and the expense. So we're going to do it once a year, and that's going to teach you this idea that theoretically, the second you do a sin, you really should be atoning for it immediately. And that's why we bring these two Shiurim, one after the other, to show you that this second one is coming to atone for whatever happened in the interim, that theoretically you should really try to get atonement right away. Again, this isn't a personal. It's for anything that might have happened in the temple, this is to atone for it. Now, why is this relevant? Well, the assumption right now is that both the animals must have been designated in the morning, and then they do one, and then they do the other. So, now, if this covers something that happened in the interim, you can apply the same concept, right? This is going to basically cover anything that happened even after the animal was designated. So it shows you here that there's this concept of designating an animal, and it can atone for things that happen afterwards. Gemara is going to say that's not really a good inference, because it only is if they were both separated from the beginning. If they designate both animals at once, then you'd be right. But what's this talking about? You must have done it. You couldn't, right? It could be that the Torah is talking about that the way to do the Sirei Atzeret is to do one after the other. Atzeret, by the way, is Shavuot. And then you do one, finish it, and then designate the other. To which the Gemara says, no, it can't be that. Because right? Should we say that the Torah is saying it when, right, the specific pasuk, right, when it says you have to bring, again, there's no pasuk that says it, but assuming we learn there's two Sirei Atzeret, you're going to have to do it only in a way where you bring one and then designate the other one later. Like it never said that in the Torah. It never, right? It doesn't make sense that the Torah would create this situation where you would have to do it one after the other, in which case, theoretically, this really could answer the question. And then it must mean that even after you designated it, it would still atone for things. However, Amar Papa says, this is not a proof. Korbanot Tzibor Kamalta? You're talking about Korbanot Tzibor? These are communal offerings. Shani Korbanot Tzibor, what happens with communal offerings? Now, an individual, right, we assume when they designate an animal, that's when they sanctify. But Korbanot, and if you wanted to say, if you wanted to cover your things, only designate it later, right? You can designate it, but only sanctify it later. That's very complicated to start telling people to do this like that. But when it's the community who's in charge, the Beit Din, right? There's people who know the laws. And when they designate those animals, the two Sirei Atzeret, you could say, delay Beit Din kaman alehem. The Beit Din makes a stipulation from the beginning. We're separating them, but we're not consecrating them yet until it's time. Meaning, I'll take these two Kivsei Atzeret, these two sheep offerings. But what am I going to say? The first one will be sanctified right now, and we'll bring that. But the second one, the sanctification, will only come in when we're ready to slaughter it. And then it can cover everything before, and we don't have a problem with that, because even though the Torah didn't stipulate it, let's say we can assume the Torah stipulates it, and we know the courts can make the stipulation from the beginning so that it will actually happen. So when it's individuals, we don't want to leave things up to will the person know or not. But when it's the court, we can assume they're going to do things properly. How do we know there's such a concept? Well, Kid Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, like Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel. The Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Korbanot Tzibur. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel that Korbanot Tzibur, communal offerings, you don't even have to specify when the Kohen brings them. He doesn't have to think, I'm bringing this for the Korban Tameh. Why? Even though Machshava, we said, is so important. Sakin moshachtan lamashehin. When they slaughter it, the knife basically designates it for where it's supposed to go. Why? Because it was already pre-designated by the court that when it's slaughtered, right, it will be for that korban. Okay? So the act of slaughter designates it, right? That puts it for a specific purpose. Okay? Even if the person slaughtering doesn't have in mind, because the court already stipulated from the beginning. That Korbanot Tzibur have a whole different system of rules here, and therefore that's why you can't try to prove this whole thing, because even though it was designated in the morning, it wasn't really consecrated yet. The consecration only hits in when it's relevant, and then we can go back and, right, we can say this doesn't prove anything. But this is all to explain Rabbi Shimon. So comes Rabbi Yosef, Bereder Rav Shmuel, Amar Rabbi Yosef, Bereder Rav Shmuel, Rav Papa. He says to Rav Papa, how can you possibly say that the whole principle of Rabbi Shimon is based on Le'beitim Ma'an Alehem? He doesn't believe that principle. He doesn't accept that principle. How do we know? Because Hamar Rav Idi bar Avin, Amar Rav Amr, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Tmidin shelo hutzrechu l'tzibur, a korban tamid that wasn't needed. Okay, what does this mean? Let's say they separate 100 animals to be used for the korban tamid, and then they used 80 and they were done. Like let's say there were 80 days left of the year. They thought, let's take a bunch of extras in case something happens to one of them. And then they have 20 extra. What do they do with the 20 extra? So l'divrei Rabbi Shimon, ein nifdim tmimim. You can't redeem them unless they become blemished because they were already consecrated. L'divrei chachamim nifdim tmimim. According to the rabbis, you can just redeem them with money, even though they don't have blemishes. Why? Because because the court stipulated from the beginning when they designated the 100 animals, they said, we're not sanctifying them yet because they knew that if they sanctified them, they'd be stuck. Right? What if they don't need them all? So you see that the rabbis hold that, but Rabbi Shimon doesn't. And we're trying to explain Rabbi Shimon. So Rav Papa, so we now had 2 attempts to reject, right? They tried to use Rabbi Shimon as a proof. They had 2 attempts to reject. The first attempt was rejected, and now the second attempt is rejected also. Okay? Rav Papa's trying to say, but this is different, right? You can, or he was really trying to reject the previous assumption. But, right, he was trying to say that, right, remember, the whole thing of Rabbi Shimon was that what's the second one doing there? It's to do anything in the interim. So the first one was, well, if you have you'd have to have it bezachars, that if you, one second, let me just get it right. If you designated them all at once, that would work. But maybe that's not the case. To which I said, what do you mean that's not the case? The Torah didn't say that. And then they said, right, you can't, right, that they tried to say maybe you can't learn anything from there. Sorry, okay, let me go back. The first attempt actually was successful until Rav Papa came and tried to reject it. But the first attempt, in the end, they tried to reject it, but in the end, they said it can't possibly be that the Torah is not talking about a case also of Vatachat, which then would prove our point is correct. They tried to say, what do you mean? And the Torah would, right? But they then say it could be that the Torah really is talking about Vatachat or B'zachar, either one, and then that would actually mean that it would cover things in between. To which Rav Papa said, no, maybe it's only because it's a korban sibur. And korban sibur, and that would explain it. But problem number 1, although we're going to raise problem number 2, the next word is va'od. And furthermore, there's another problem with Rav Papa. The first problem is that Rabbi Shimon doesn't seem to hold leibeti matneh. Okay, and with that, we finished today's stop. We'll do a very quick review. We started with this issue of the Reish Lakish. Why didn't he suggest to Rabbi Elazar that maybe the korban of the yoledet, the children bring the olah because they can get atonement through it, to which we said because they don't acquire it. And then we had a whole debate. Do they acquire? Do they not acquire? We tried to go back and forth. What we really did today was bring 2 sources to try to prove that they don't acquire. And in the end, right, we proved both of them were really from the Tamora case. 2 attempts to try to say that it sounds like they do acquire. In the end, we said, no, they don't acquire. Then we moved to the question of if the first one doesn't, right, what's the purpose of the first one if the second one atones, or what's the purpose of the second one if the first one atones? And in the end, we said it must be the first one is just because you designated it lishma, and the second one is the real atonement. And that answered the question, which one really does the atonement? And then we went to this question about the korban olah, about the aseh lachar fresh or not, and that I just reviewed. So we'll end here. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and a Shavua Tov.